I have been hard questioned about you since we parted, first by the Roundhead Heatherstone, who plied me in all manner of ways to find out whether you are, what you assert, the grandson of Jacob, or some other person. I really believe that he fancies you are the Duke of York, but he could not get any more from me than what I knew. I told him that your grandfather's cottage was his own property, and a grant to his forefathers, that you were brought up at Arnwood and had joined your grandfather after the death of the colonel, and the murderous burning of the house and all within it by his party. But the pretty little daughter was more curious still. She cross-questioned me in every way when her father was not present, and at last begged me as a favor to tell you not to take the deer, as her father was very strict in his duty, and if caught you would be imprisoned.
Many thanks to her for her caution, but I hope to take one today, nevertheless, replied Edward. A hart royal is not meat for Roundheads, although the king's servants may feast on them.
That's truly said. Well, now I must see your woodcraft. You shall be the leader of the chase.
Think you we can harbor a stag about here?
Yes, in this month, no doubt.
Let us walk on, said Edward. The wind is fresh from the eastern quarter. We will face it, if you please, or, rather, keep it blowing on our right cheek for the present.
"'Tis well,"
replied Oswald, and they walked for about half an hour. This is the slot of a doe, said Edward in a low voice, pointing to the marks. Yonder thicket is a likely harbor for the stag. They proceeded, and Edward pointed out to Oswald the slot of the stag into the thicket. They then walked round and found no marks of the animal having left his lair. "He is here," whispered Edward, and Oswald made a sign for Edward to enter the thicket while he walked to the other side. Edward entered the thicket cautiously. In the center he perceived, through the trees, a small cleared spot covered with high fern, and felt certain that the stag was lying there. He forced his way on his knees till he had a better view of the place, and then cocked his gun. The noise induced the stag to move his antlers and discover his lair. Edward could just perceive the eye of the animal through the heath. He waited till the beast settled again, took steady aim, and fired. At the report of the gun, another stag sprung up and burst away. Oswald fired and wounded it, but the animal made off, followed by the dogs. Edward, who hardly knew whether he had missed or not, but felt almost certain that he had not, hastened out of the thicket to join in the chase, and as he passed through the fern patch, perceived that his quarry lay dead. He then followed the chase, and being very fleet of foot, soon came up with Oswald and passed him without speaking. The stag made for a swampy ground, and finally took to the water beyond it, and stood at bay. Edward then waited for Oswald, who came up with him. "He has soiled," said Edward, "and now you may go in and kill him." Oswald, eager in the chase, hastened up to where the dogs and stag were in the water, and put a bullet through the animal's head. Edward went to him, assisted him to drag the stag out of the water, and then Oswald cut its throat, and proceeded to perform the usual offices.
"How did you happen to miss him?" said Oswald, "for these are my shots."
"Because I never fired at him," said Edward. "My quarry lies dead in the fern, and a fine fellow he is."
"This is a warrantable stag," said Oswald.
"Yes, but mine is a hart royal, as you will see when we go back." As soon as Oswald had done his work, he hung the quarters of the animal on an oak tree and went back with Edward.
"Where did you hit him, Edward?"
said Oswald as they walked along. "I could only see his eye through the fern, and I must have hit him thereabouts." On their arrival at the spot, Oswald found that Edward had put the ball right into the eye of the stag.
"Well," said he, "you made me suppose that you knew something of our craft, but I did not believe that you were so apt as you thought yourself to be. I now confess that you are a master, as far as I can see, in all branches of the craft. This is indeed a hart royal. 25 antlers, as I live! Come, out with your knife and let us finish, for if we are to go to the cottage, we have no time to lose. It will be dark in half an hour."
They hung all the quarters of the stag as before, and then set off for Jacob's cottage, Edward proposing that Oswald should take the cart and pony to carry the meat home next morning, and that he would accompany him to bring it back.
"That will do capitally," said Oswald, "and here we are, if I recollect right, and I hope there is something to eat."
"No fear of that. Alice will be prepared for us," replied Edward. Their dinner was ready for them, and Oswald praised the cooking. He was much surprised to see that Jacob had 4 grandchildren. After dinner he went into Jacob's room and remained with him more than an hour. During this conference Jacob confided to Oswald that the 4 children were the sons and daughters of Colonel Beverley, supposed to have been burned in the firing of Arnwood. Oswald came out, much surprised as well as pleased with the information, and with the confidence reposed in him. He saluted Edward and Humphrey respectfully and said,
"I was not aware with whom I was in company, sir, as you may well imagine, but the knowledge of it has made my heart glad."
"Nay, Oswald," replied Edward, "remember that I am still Edward Armitage, and that we are the grandchildren of old Jacob."
"Certainly, sir, I will, for your sake, not forget that such is to be supposed to be the case. I assure you, I think it very fortunate that Jacob has confided the secret to me, as it may be in my power to be useful. I little thought that I should ever have had my dinner cooked by the daughter of Colonel Beverley."
They then entered into a long conversation, during which Oswald expressed his opinion that the old man was sinking fast, and would not last more than 3 or 4 days. Oswald had a bed made up for him on the floor of the room where Edward and Humphrey slept, and the next morning they set off, at an early hour, with the pony and cart, loaded it with venison, and took it across the forest to the keeper's lodge. It was so late when they arrived that Edward consented to pass the night there and return home on the following morning. Oswald went into the sitting room to speak with the intendant of the forest, leaving Edward in the kitchen with Phoebe, the maid-servant. He told the intendant that he had brought home some fine venison, and wished his orders about it. He also stated that he had been assisted by Edward Armitage, who had brought the venison home for him in his cart, and who was now in the kitchen, as he would be obliged to pass the night there. And on being questioned, he was lavish in his praises of Edward's skill and knowledge of woodcraft, which he declared to be superior to his own.
"It proves that the young man has had much practice at all events," replied Mr. Heatherstone, smiling. "He has been living at the king's expense, but he must not follow it up at the cost of the Parliament. It would be well to take this young man as a ranger if we could, for although he is opposed to us, yet if he once took our service he would be faithful, I am sure. You can propose it to him, Oswald. The haunches of that hart royal must be sent up to General Cromwell tomorrow. The remainder we will give directions for, as soon as I have made up my mind how to dispose of it."
Oswald left the room and came back to Edward.
"General Cromwell is to have the haunches of your stag," said he to Edward, smiling, "and the intendant proposes that you should take service as one of the rangers."
"I thank you," replied Edward, "but I've no fancy to find venison for General Cromwell and his Roundheads, and so you may tell the intendant, with many thanks for his good will toward me, nevertheless."
"I thought as much, but the man meant kindly, that I really think. Now, Phoebe, what can you give us to eat, for we are hungry?"
"You should be served directly," replied Phoebe. "I have some steaks on the fire."
"And you must find a bed for my young friend here."
"I have none in the house, but there is plenty of good straw over the stables."
"That will do," replied Edward. "I'm not particular."
"I suppose not. Why should you be?" replied Phoebe, who was rather old and rather cross. "If you mount the ladder that you will see against the wall, you will find a good bed when you are at the top of it." Oswald was about to remonstrate, but Edward held up his finger, and no more was said. As soon as they finished their supper, Phoebe proposed that they should go to bed. It was late, and she would sit up no longer. Edward rose and went out, followed by Oswald, who had given up the keeper's house to the intendant and his daughter, and slept in the cottage of one of the rangers, about 1/4 of a mile off. After some conversation, they shook hands and parted, as Edward intended returning very early the next morning, being anxious about old Jacob. Edward went up the ladder into the loft. There was no door to shut out the wind, which blew piercingly cold, and after a time he found himself so chilled that he could not sleep. He rose to see if he could not find some protection from the wind by getting more into a corner, for although Phoebe had told him there was plenty of straw, it proved that there was very little indeed in the loft, barely enough to lie down upon. Edward, after a time, descended the ladder to walk in the yard, that by exercise he might recover the use of his limbs. At last, turning to and fro, he cast his eyes up to the window of the